Thank you for joining our fourth episode of ETFs Unwrapped, a guide for asset manager COOs and operational leaders looking at launching ETFs in Europe. Since autumn, I've actually moved roles to be the head of asset owners and asset managers client lines for the Americas. This is something that's very exciting for me, and we have a considerable client list of ETFs in South America. Even more exciting is that I'm going to hand over the baton to our new ETF leader and my longtime colleague, Danielle Gonzalez.
Thanks, Jeff, and indeed, I'm very pleased to receive the baton. I have been with BNP Paribas for over 25 years, heading up several funds and institutional investors' businesses across Europe and Latin America. Now I'm back in my native Spain and really pleased to be heading up the ETF business for security services. But I'm even more pleased to be introducing our special guest for this episode, Martijn Rozemuller, who is the CEO of VanEck Europe, a major global asset manager based in the US with a very successful ETF franchise also in Europe. Martijn co-founded Think ETFs, which VanEck later acquired. He's very well known for his innovative approach to investing and passion for financial education. Hi, Martijn. Thanks so much for joining us.
Hi, Daniel. Well, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be on.
Thanks, and we do appreciate having you. And the reason we have met is thanks to the recent report on European ETFs, which we published in partnership with Funds Europe in December. You were one of the participants and you had some really interesting views and advice around success in European ETFs. So maybe let me start by addressing the first question, which is quite common in the marketplace. Given your experience, what do you think makes the European ETF market different to the US one?
Well, it's a great question. I hope you have a bit of time because there will be a longer answer to it. And I think actually the US and the European ETF market couldn't be more different, I think. Now, the obvious differences are in, let's say, the fact that Europe has many different languages. So if you want to market your product, you need to have all the materials available in all of these different languages. But then you also have to deal with different regulators. And even though in Europe, like in the US, we supposedly have one European regulator, we also have all of the local regulators that on certain topics take maybe just a bit of a different stance than the European regulator. So it's very important to have that in mind as well. To give a couple of examples, if you want to market in let's say Belgium or Italy, regulator wants to know upfront what you're going to do. In a lot of other countries, they will basically use the same rules, but they will only let you know after the commercial activity whether it was okay or not. Then there's another big difference, and I think from a practical perspective, that's probably the most important one. Now, ETFs by nature are exchange-traded products, so you have to have a listing. Now, in the US, it's quite simple because you have basically one exchange where you list the ETFs, and all European or all US investors have access to that. In Europe, it's obviously different. There's many European exchanges. Most European investors, especially the more professional ones, will have access to probably most or all of these exchanges. But especially when you deal with retail investors, they don't always have access to all of the exchanges. So it's important that you basically are present on all of them, which obviously is an increase in cost. It's also an increase in capacity, for instance, on your capital markets department. But it also is an increase on the efforts and cost that you have to have in place to basically have good liquidity providers, market makers, available on those exchanges. So that makes it quite a bit different from the US. And then having said all that, there's also one last difference, and that has to do with basically your clients. So in the US, I think because of the fact that ETFs have been around there for a lot longer than Europe, people are more used to them. people have better knowledge about them, especially on the retail side of things. I believe a US retail investor is usually a little bit more sophisticated than a European one. Maybe for the simple fact that US citizens have been aware much longer that they need to take some form of control over their pension, over their future wealth. And in Europe, that's less common, I think. And people are starting to realize that over the last maybe 5 to 8 years, but we still have some catching up to do, and that's one of the reasons that at VanEck, but I think this goes across basically all of the ETF industry, that there is some emphasis on education. I think it's really important that we increase the level of knowledge with European investors to make them see the benefits of ETFs. And that's something our US colleagues don't have to do. People are aware of the benefits, and that makes it easier. So I did warn you, long answer. I hope it wasn't too boring, but yeah, I simply had to touch upon all of these points.
Indeed, I think it makes complete sense. And you were alluding different languages, different regulations, different market practices, the cost of liquidity. So definitely more fragmentation in Europe. But I guess this fragmentation allows also for flexibility. So what do you think the main choices an European ETF issuer needs to make when deciding to launch a new product?
Well, I guess, yeah, the most important choice basically obviously is what product are we going to launch? But if the question basically is meant to answer the part after you have come up with this great product, and then you have to decide how will we market it across Europe, well, it depends a little bit on your status as an issuer. So if you already have pan-European presence and a brand and people recognize you, it's a little easier because you have everything in place. And I think the best way to do it is just introduce the product on multiple exchanges, reach out to multiple distribution partners, make sure that it's kind of a big bang. But a lot of new issuers, they don't have that infrastructure in place yet. They don't have that brand recognition. What country do we go to first? Which client group do we target first? And I guess the best answer I can give is I would focus on the middle part of Europe. So if you simply look at the map, then anything sort of in between the UK to the Netherlands, Germany, Switzerland, Italy, that kind of middle band of Europe is already quite receptive to ETFs. So if you have to pick anywhere to start, that's probably where I would start, because you don't really have to explain too much anymore about ETFs, because the knowledge or the experience is higher in those areas. If you go farther north or farther south, you'll find out that ETFs are less common. People know a little bit less about them, so it's harder. So yeah, I would definitely focus on the middle part, and maybe even if you are, for instance, a US issuer and you want to start in Europe, I guess the UK is a good starting point.
Thanks a lot for these insights. And in the Fund Zero report, you describe yourself as being the craft beer of ETFs, as you have been launching very specific, innovative themes. So noting both your personal and professional path, I'm really curious to understand what drives innovation and how do you think other managers could best innovate in the European ETF space?
Well, it's an interesting question, because it's definitely the question I asked myself when I became part of VanEck about 8 years ago already. So I think at the time, Think ETFs, the company that I used to run before VanEck took over, and VanEck combined, I guess we probably had maybe 12 ETFs in total. And most of them were either very generic, very broad and general exposure, and some of them were very specific, like a theme like gold miners. And when we were integrating the business, we took about a year to integrate both businesses to kind of become one. And I started to already think about, obviously, what if the integration is done? Where do we need to go? And I guess the first moment it really hit us was probably early 2020. So we were, I guess, about 2 years a combined business. And one of the first ETFs that really took off after VanEck acquired Think ETFs was a ETF that was kind of targeting the video gaming and esports industry. Now, this is obviously a very thematic product. And I remember at first our US colleagues had launched it, I guess 2019, and we thought it was fun. We thought it's a nice gimmick type of product.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't really expect it to become like a blockbuster product because of the fact that it was so specific, but we thought it's cool, and you can have some nice short videos to promote it. You can use some, well, even video game footage to get the message across. Our US colleagues had made a really cool video that really did well on YouTube. So we started to use that one, and it really took off in, let's say, early 2020. And in hindsight, we definitely have to admit that we were a little bit lucky at the time, because obviously early 2020, COVID hit Europe. A lot of people were working from home. So I guess more people played video games than in the years before. And they had more time on their hands also to think about maybe their investments. So I guess a combination of different factors made this product a big success. And even then, it took us a little time to realize, hey, we're maybe onto something here. By having this very different kind of product in the market, people notice us earlier, because we already knew that we were not going to launch the next S&P 500 or the next MSCI World, because those products were available in many different shapes and forms, and mainly the only difference was the fee. So we realized if you want to compete there, if you want to compete on fee, well, first of all, it's going to be very hard to get any market share. But even if you do, it's going to be at a very low revenue. So it doesn't really make sense. And also from the investor's perspective, if you don't really bring something new that they can use in their portfolio, you're not really adding a lot of value for them. You could maybe be taking out a little bit of cost, but that's different than adding value. So we also really believe in diversification. So what we came up with is, if we are able to get these crafted ETFs, like the really special ones, and we make them pure play, then we should have the ability to bring ETFs to market that have companies in them that would not be in your typical S&P 500 or MSCI World ETF. So we actually are adding value in the sense that we add diversification. And the other idea was that if we find interesting themes early enough, then people who start using them early enough will benefit from it if it turns out to be the long-term trend that we hope to discover. And I guess in a number of examples, that has basically played out over the last 5 or 6 years as we intended. And I think that's why we like to refer to ourselves as basically the crafted beers, because if you look at S&P 500 or MSCI, you could probably compare that to the big brands, but we like to be more like the smaller ones, maybe even the monastery breweries of the ETF industry.
Yeah, I really like the analogy, and I think it's a very good one. And I think it shows that the innovation is really about thinking differently and not following just what everyone does. So I think it's very useful. And indeed, as we are currently servicing VanEck ETFs in Brazil, we do see on a day-to-day basis this constant quest for innovation that you have, and this aim at providing the best solutions for your clients. So, and maybe before closing, I would be curious to know, how do you see the ETF market evolving? What do you think are the main challenges and opportunities that we will see in the next years?
Well, let's start with opportunities. I'm positive guy by nature, so I like to look at the upside. I think there is a lot of opportunity in the European ETF market going forward, mainly because the rate of adoption is still low compared to, for instance, the US. I think we still have a long way to go. Earlier in the conversation, I mentioned sort of the middle band of Europe, from UK to Netherlands, Germany, Switzerland, Italy. So even there, even though the adoption is higher, it's still lower than in the US. So there are still growth opportunities there. And then if you look farther north and farther south, there is even more opportunity. I think France is a really nice example. France has actually been a positive surprise to us last year. The rate at which French investors are opening up to ETFs is actually better than I expected. So that's very promising. I expect something similar for Spain and also for the Nordics. So I think purely from a size of the market perspective, there is a lot of opportunity still, and I think not only for the ETF issuers, but I guess the benefits will mainly end up at the European retail investors. They will be way better off when it comes to cost, and it's going to be their benefit in the next 10 or 20 years. And I think if I speak personally, to me, there's a couple of things that I'm a little bit mindful of when it comes to ETF innovation, and then it's about the ETF as a vehicle, as a wrapper, can be used for many things, but I think in essence it's best used with passive strategies, being very transparent at very reasonable cost. But there's obviously the sort of the seduction to also put other types of investment exposure in it. So over the last 12 to 18 months, we've heard a lot about active strategies being wrapped in ETFs. Now, I'm not per se against active management, but I do think you have to be careful how you position it and how you bring it to market. And I think if you really want to have an active strategy, it's going to be a little bit more difficult to wrap it in an ETF with intraday liquidity. And also you need to be mindful of the cost, obviously. And this goes even a little bit further when you think about leveraged or inverse products. Now, I'm sure there is a place in the market somewhere for them. I'm not a big fan personally, because I think the leverage or the inverse structure makes it difficult to benefit from it over the long term. Your view on the market has to become reality in a short time frame, because otherwise you will start losing money on the products. And I think over the last decades, it became quite clear that most investors have a hard time predicting the markets in the short term. And although it may be very enticing, because if you do it right, you can make a lot of money, but still it's hard. So I believe that leveraged or inverse products should not be wrapped in ETFs. I think the ETF wrapper or brand should be basically reserved for the more straightforward, passive, transparent, low-cost solutions, and not other stuff. Last example may be private markets, private equity, private debt. There's also a lot of talk about those assets being wrapped in ETFs. Well, to me, it's called private market for a reason. It's not publicly listed, and that makes the liquidity a big challenge if you want to wrap it in an ETF. And there's obviously ways to maybe mitigate that a little bit, but it'll never be perfect. So my view is, if something is not really suitable for an ETF, find another way to bring it to the customer. Don't try to torture it into an ETF when it's not the perfect vehicle to do that. So I think the challenge for the ETF industry that already exists could be to make sure that there's not a lot of confusion created by bringing products to market that are basically labeled an ETF, but could move or behave very differently than what people expect of an ETF.
Thanks, Martijn. And I know the importance of preserving somehow the nature of ETFs while allowing also for more active strategies. So something definitely important to see how it evolves in the European ETF market. It was definitely very interesting to hear your insights on the complexity of the European ETF market and on how important innovation is to succeed. So thanks again for your time. It was great to have you in our podcast. And let me thank also all our listeners, and I hope you have enjoyed this 4th episode of ETFs Unwrapped. We'll be back soon with another exciting episode.
The information contained within this recording is believed to be reliable, but BNP Paribas does not warrant its completeness or accuracy. Opinions and estimates contained herein constitute BNP Paribas' judgment and are subject to change without notice. BNP Paribas and its subsidiaries shall not be liable for any errors, omissions, or opinions contained within this recording. This material is not intended as an offer or solicitation for the purchase or sale of any financial instrument. For the avoidance of doubt, any information contained within this recording will not form an agreement between parties. Additional information is available on request.